Our bet is sort of that in the next year, probably, I don't know, maybe half the development is going to be done by AI as opposed to people, and then that will just kind of increase from there.
Mark Zuckerberg and Satya Nadella, the CEOs of Meta and Microsoft respectively, got together for a fireside chat at LlamaCon 2025, and they covered everything from open source to agents to how coding is going to look very different in the next year and a half. Let's watch it. I'll give you my thoughts. All right, so we're gonna go a little bit out of order. I wanna go straight to the part where they talk about AI coding and specifically how much code is written for their respective companies by AI already and what the future might look like, because it is fascinating.
In terms of the coding and how it improves that, do you have a sense of how much of the code, like what percent of the code that's being written inside Microsoft at this point is written by AI as opposed to by the engineers?
Yeah, so there's two sort of things we're tracking. One is the accept rates itself, right? That's sort of whatever, 30, 40, it's going up monotonically. And it depends, like one of the big challenges we had for a long time is a lot of our code is still C++, C Sharp, and C Sharp is pretty good, but C++ it was not that great. Python is fantastic. So we've now get better at that. So as language support has increased, the code completions have gotten good.
That's because the models aren't trained on C++ as much, obviously. There's some training data there for C++, but I don't believe C++ is open source. And certainly if you're writing C++, you're using a lot of closed source tools. But Python on the other end is open source. The tools you use are open source, the libraries are open source, and that has made these models really good at being able to write Python because simply there's a lot of it to train on.
The place where the agentic code still, it's sort of nascent. For new greenfield, it's very, very high. But as I said, nothing is greenfield in many cases. And so therefore, I would say maybe at this point, the PR, by the way, code reviews are very high. So in fact, the agents we have for reviewing code, that usage has increased. And so I'd say maybe.
Yeah, I want to pause here for a second because it's very interesting. He says basically nothing is greenfield or very few things are greenfield. But that's only true if you have a massive legacy company with a massive amount of legacy code. Microsoft is run on code that was written decades ago. So not only are the agents not as good at writing those languages, but there's just so much code, so much dependency between the code that it's hard for these agents to understand and actually iterate on those types of code bases. The context is just too large, at least for now. But that doesn't mean that there's another company, a startup, building something from scratch, building code in a way that is especially written to be iterated on by AI that isn't going to be able to accelerate to a pace much faster than Microsoft can even imagine. So although there are very few greenfield opportunities for Microsoft, that doesn't mean there aren't many greenfield opportunities for everybody else. He also says that code reviews are a big part of what they use AI for, and that would make sense because with code reviews, you're taking a subset of the total amount of code, you're seeing the differences, the diff between the new code and the old code, and you're asked to review it. Does it make sense? Does it make sense within the context of the related code around the code you just changed? And so that does seem like something AI could do incredibly well. But now he's going to talk about specific percentages. And keep in mind, usually there's no distinguishing between code completion, which is done by AI. So you start typing a line of code, a function, and you just hit tab and it completes. That's technically AI written. But if you are completely relying on AI to write code, for example, you're assigning a PR to an agent, I would consider that kind of a different level of AI coding. But I think it's all mixed together in this number he's about to say.
That usage has increased. And so I'd say maybe 20, 30% of the code that is inside of our repos today in some of our projects are probably all written by software. What about you guys?
I actually don't have the number off the top of my head, but I mean, it's, I think, I think a lot of the stats that people say are still effectively of this like autocomplete variety.
Yeah.
But we have a bunch of teams that are working on basically doing feed ranking experiments and ads ranking and like very contained domains where you can study the history of all of the changes that have been made and like and make a change. And that I think is kind of an interesting area for us to work in. But the big one that we're focused on is building an AI and a machine learning engineer to advance the llama development itself, right? Because
And what he just said is probably subtly the most important thing in this entire talk. They are developing artificial intelligence that can do ML and AI research. Again, and I've said it 1,000 times, that's the intelligence explosion. Once AI can iterate and self-improve, then it is just a function of how many agents we can throw at that self-improvement. And then it is exponential by nature. And let me just pause this conversation to tell you about today's sponsor, Outskill. Outskill is a live 2-day AI training program for professionals, founders, and executives. Through this live 2-day program, you will master the skills of AI, including the basics of generative AI, automations, building AI agents, image and video generations, generating full-fledged websites, and more. The 2-day training happens Saturdays and Sundays from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern, and there's an initial kickoff Friday, 10 a.m. 2 days, 16 hours, 5 sessions. You will learn so much. 50,000 professionals have already attended these sessions over the last 6 months, and they've landed consulting gigs, built AI products, or just upskilled themselves in their existing roles. They also offer live Q&A sessions with mentors so you can ask the questions and clear up any doubt that you might have and clarify any topics that might be confusing. So check out Outskill. I'll drop a link down below. It's free for the first 1,000 people who register. And thanks again to Outskill. Now back to the video. All right, so let's keep watching and think about the possible intelligence explosion that he is really describing here.
But the big one that we're focused on is building an AI and a machine learning engineer to advance the llama development itself, right? Because I mean, our bet is sort of that in the next year, probably, you know, I don't know, maybe half the development is going to be done by AI as opposed to people, and then that will just kind of increase from there. So I was just curious if you were seeing something similar or different.
I mean, to me, the SWE agent is the sort of the first attempt. So the question for us is, in the next year, can we get like, let's take a kernel optimization, right? Will we get to sort of something like that happens? I think it's more likely. Whether
By the way, when he's saying SWE agent, he's saying software engineering agent. Just think agent that writes code for you.
Comes up with a novel model architecture change, probably not. So the question is, which task?
Yeah, no, optimizations, security improvements, that type of stuff, I think seems like it's pretty high opportunity.
Honestly, it sounds like Zuckerberg might be thinking more in the future than Satya is, unless Satya is playing his cards close to the vest. Now, Microsoft isn't really developing their own models. They're partnering with everybody else. Meta is developing their own models. He's probably thinking about making these models able to self-improve, maybe more so than a Microsoft would be.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're also trying to solve a different problem on it because, I mean, you guys serve like a lot of developers and engineers, that's like your core business. Whereas for us, we're thinking about this more as a thing to improve our internal development and then improve the llama models, which other people can use. But it's not something that we do the end-to-end workflow on in the way that you do. So it's always just interesting to hear how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's going to be changing. I think they might be both trying to deceive each other, or at least they're definitely not telling the full story, because Meta just launched an API. So they are kind of creeping in the direction of serving developers, providing inference. And yeah, that's Microsoft's territory.
The other thing for us is, to your point, our core business, in fact, Bill started the company as a tools company. And so to us, the interesting thing I think about now is maybe the way we should reconceptualize our tools and infrastructure, quite frankly, are the tools and the infrastructure for the agents to use. Because even the SWE agent needs a bunch of tools.
That's the key. The entire technology stack needs to be rethought for the world of agents. How will agents write code? How will they retrieve things from a database? How will they browse the web? How will they talk to each other? How will they do tool usage? All of these things need to be standardized. They need to be figured out. It's so early and very exciting for that reason. But he's exactly right. We need to figure out what the world of software and beyond looks like when we're thinking about AI first.
And what shape should they be? What should their infrastructure, what should their sandboxes be? So a lot of what we're going to do is essentially evolve even what does the GitHub repo construct even look for the SWE agent?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting concept, and I mean, I tend to think that like every engineer is effectively going to end up being more of like a tech lead in the future that has sort of their own little army of
That's right.
engineering agents that they work with.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That is the orchestrator that I was describing, a tech lead orchestrating tens, hundreds of different agents. How these agents work together to execute on the task assigned to them by the orchestrator is yet to be determined. And we do need to rethink what a repository looks like, because instead of a human team of 5, 10, 20 people working on a single repo on different branches, now you could have 5, 10, hundreds of agents working on a single branch at the same time in coordination. I don't know. I really don't even know what it's going to look like. Maybe that's completely off. Let me know what you think, by the way. Tell me in the comments. Next, they're going to talk about what new developers, if you are getting started in the development industry, what should you be thinking about? How should you be thinking about AI, coding, and everything else involved with writing software? And I get this question personally all the time. People asking me, should I learn to code? Is it still worth learning to code? I think for now, yeah. But in the long run, knowing how to do the actual base code might not be as relevant. I think it'll be cool to know. I think it'll be something artisanal almost. But agents are going to be writing the vast majority of our code. So it's more about learning how to interact with your AI agent team. And also, I think that it is incredibly important to learn how to do systems thinking. So learning how to code teaches you systems thinking. You don't necessarily need to know any individual programming language, but learning that systems thinking, first of all, even if you never write a line of code, is just valuable in life. But even if you're orchestrating agents, systems thinking is important.
I guess there's always this question, if you were getting started as a developer today building something, how would you think about which tools you'd be using?
I think that one of the biggest sort of, I'll call it, I don't know, dreams, pursuits, questions that Bill sort of inculcated in all of us was, what's the difference between, he used to sort of talk about it more like, what's the difference between a document and an application and a website? Right now, if you use Meta AI, ChatGPT, Copilot, what have you, it's unclear to me what's the difference between a chat session. And then I go to pages in our case, like literally even coming down, I was like reading up everything about Llama 4, all the models. Like literally I was just doing a bunch of chat sessions, adding it to a document effectively in pages, persisting it. And then you can go give it. I mean, since you have code completion, you can go, make it an app or what have you. And so this idea that you can start with a high-level intent and end up with what is an artifact that is a living artifact that you would have called in the past an application is going to have profound implications, I think, on workflows. And I think we're at the beginning of that. And that's what my dream is. So if I sort of say, as a builder of infrastructure and tools and as a user of it, these artificial category boundaries, not artificial, or these category boundaries that were created mostly because of limitations of how our software worked. Perhaps you transcend. In fact, the other thing we used to always think about is, why are Word, Excel, PowerPoint different? Why isn't it one thing? And we've tried multiple attempts of it. But now you can conceive of it, right? Which is you can start in Word and you can sort of visualize things like Excel and present it, and they can all be persisted as one data structure or what have you. And so to me, that malleability that was not as robust before is now there.
Yeah, interesting. Makes sense.
Yeah, so I think what he's getting to is the interface between humans and data. And he's saying there's the malleability between these different pieces of siloed software. But really what I think it's going to end up being is there's going to be an AI agent between human and the ground truth data. I think that is the perfect architecture for the future. The ground truth data is going to be stored in a traditional database. Maybe it doesn't look like a database we know today, but it's going to be a persisted database. It is going to be deterministic by nature. That is the ground truth. Then there's going to be an agent and then a human on the other side. The human is going to need to do something, learn something, figure something out, assign something, whatever it is. And they're going to talk to the agent. The agent is going to do everything else. It's going to write all the software. It's going to retrieve all the data necessary to accomplish the task assigned to it. With that in mind, there really is no software. And I've said this before. I know I've said software is dead, a little bit tongue in cheek, but if you really think about it, there's going to be a database, there's going to be an agentic layer, and then there's going to be the human on top orchestrating everything. And at that point, where are the applications? I don't know. I don't know if there are any. Let's keep watching. All right, next, Mark asks Satya about how he thinks about the actual application of artificial intelligence. He prefaces with Satya saying, well, all of this infrastructure investment, all of this innovation in AI needs to be reflected in GDP growth. And of course it does. As a capitalist society, the investment actually needs to have a return or it's going to be a failure. And so he asks him, how do you think about that? So let's watch.
I'm curious how you think, what's your current outlook on sort of what we should be looking for to understand the progress that this is making and how we would, and kind of like where you expect that to be over like a 3, 5, 7-year period?
To me, I think that's right. Because to us, I would say it's a pretty existential priority, quite frankly. The world needs sort of a new factor of production, an input that allows us to deal with a lot of the challenges we have. And the best way to think about it is, hey, what would it take, let's say, for the developed world to grow at 10%, right? Which may have been some of the peak numbers during, let's say, the Industrial Revolution or what have you. And for that to happen, then you have to sort of have productivity gains in every function, right? In healthcare, in retail, in broad knowledge work, in any industry. And for that to happen, I think AI has the promise, but you now have to sort of really have it deliver the real change in productivity. And that requires software and also management change, right? Because in some sense, people have to work with it differently. People always quote what happened with electricity, right? It was there for 50 years before people figured out that, hey, we got to really change the factories to really use electricity differently, right? And that is the famous Ford case study. And so to me, we are somewhere in between. I hope we don't take 50 years. But I do feel that by just thinking of this as the horseless carriage is also not going to be the way we're going to get to the other side. So it's not just tech. Tech has got to progress. You got to put that into systems that actually deliver the new work artifact and workflow.
So I don't think I can say it any better than he just said it. There are problems, and AI has the promise to solve a lot of these problems that are existential to not only the United States, but to the earth as a whole.
So, you've said a number of times that this moment in technology around the growth of AI sort of reminds you of some of the important transformations in the past, from going to client server and the beginning of the web and things like that. So I'm curious to unpack
so
that.
for me, it's interesting, right? Which is each time there is this transition, everything of the stack gets relitigated. And you get to sort of go back to the first principles and start building. I thought, like, even the shape of the cloud infrastructure for me that I built starting, let's say, in 2007, 8 to what have you, the core storage system for training doesn't look like the core storage system you built, or this workload of training, right? The data parallel synchronous workload is so different, let's say, Hadoop or what have you. So the fact that you kind of have to rethink everything up and down a tech stack with each of these platform shifts is sort of what I think we face from time to time. It sort of grows from what was there. The web was born on Windows, but it went far beyond that. That's kind of how I think about this as well.
So to me, this is the most exciting thing about this new wave that we're going through right now. And personally, I believe it's the biggest wave of innovation and technology in history. But basically, we get to reimagine what the infrastructure of everything looks like because of artificial intelligence. We're in this kind of awkward phase right now. And typically when a brand new technology comes out, everybody scrambles to try to fit it into the way that things already worked, the existing patterns that everybody's used to. So a couple of examples of that. In the early days of the internet, everybody just rushed to take what was an existing pattern, print media, and just literally slap it onto a website. And what they didn't realize was there was this entire interactive layer that was possible, and so many other elements that you just couldn't have with print media that was possible by having the internet. And I think AI coding is a great example. Right now, we're using AI to help us code, but using our traditional patterns. A lot of the tools we're using are essentially traditional IDEs with AI kind of slapped onto it. And now we're starting to get more. We're getting tools like Cursor, Replit, Windsurf, and these tools are starting to head in the right direction where we're thinking about things from the ground up. What does coding look like in the future where it is almost entirely done by AI and the human is the orchestrator? And so again, we are just scratching the surface of what is possible. And the exciting thing is we get to invent this new pattern for how AI interacts with basically everything in our lives. All right, let's keep watching.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you've made this point a bunch of times around how as things get more efficient, it changes the way it works and people just end up consuming a lot more of the services, right?
Yeah, so he's talking about Javons Paradox. As a resource becomes cheaper, the intuition is that people will spend less on it because if demand stays the same and prices are less, then the total price paid will also be less. But with Javons Paradox, what it shows, and this was easily shown with DeepSeek R1, the cheaper something gets, the more efficient something gets, it actually has the opposite effect. Although the per unit cost goes down, the total consumption of that resource goes up. All right, let's keep watching.
How you're seeing that play out around all these AI models, right? You're seeing like generation over generation, they're just getting so much more efficient and delivering more intelligence than the last generation. And obviously it's all happening super quickly. So I'm not sure kind of what you see in that, but
yeah, I mean, if you think about it, right, which is, we were all, a few years ago sitting around and saying, oh my, what's happened to Moore's Law? Is it over? What do we do? And here we are in some crazy sort of hyperdrive Moore's Law, right? And it's always been also the case, right, which is any one of these tech platform shifts has not been about one S-curve. It's been multiple S-curves that compound, right? Even if you take just the fact that the chips are getting better. People like Jensen or Lisa are doing tremendous innovation.
Jensen and Lisa are cousins. Don't forget that. Jensen, CEO of NVIDIA. Lisa Su, CEO of AMD.
Their cycle times have gotten faster. So let's say that's Moore's Law. But on top of that, everything at the fleet, the system software optimization, the model architecture optimizations, the kernel optimizations for inference, the app server, even the prompt caching, how good we've gotten in. And so you add all of that up for every 6 months, 12 months, you have a 10x perhaps improvement, right? And so when you have capability improvement of that rate and the prices drop at that rate, fundamentally consumption goes up. So I'm very optimistic that we are at a stage where deep applications can get built.
Yeah, and keep in mind, when he says applications, he is talking about the software built on top of the infrastructure and model and hardware layers. And I think that is probably the biggest opportunity today is building applications on top of these models. And I still think there's a lot of opportunity to build the infrastructure, the scaffolding around the models. I just posted about that on Twitter. By the way, if you don't follow me, at Matthew Berman on Twitter. Things like memory management, coding assistance, agentic frameworks, tool use, prompt management and optimization. There's so much to do there. But then on top of that, the thing that really we've seen very little of to date is the application layer. How are we going to deliver all of this amazing AI to consumers and to enterprise? That is still being figured out. That is probably the least explored area of the AI stack to date.
Where you have an orchestration layer with these agents, with multiple models. I feel like we're at that place because if you think about even the first generation of apps, they were very coupled to one model. But we are finally getting to multi-model applications where I can orchestrate, in fact, a deterministic workflow, an app, an agent that was built on one model, talking to another agent. We even have these protocols are helpful, whether it's MCP, whether it's A2N, whatever. These are all good things. If we can standardize a bit, and then we can build applications that are, taking advantage of, I would say, the these capability building, but it has flexibility. And that's where I think open source absolutely has a massive, massive role to play.
Yeah, so he just mentioned a lot of things that I'm very interested in. Agentic frameworks where you can coordinate multiple agents together, being able to have each of those agents powered by individual large language models, even from different providers. Let's say you have one from OpenAI, you have another from Meta, you have another from Anthropic, and they're all talking to each other. You're finding the best model for the specific task at hand. And then even within that, even within each individual prompt, you have things like model routing. And you can actually optimize on a per prompt basis for the cheapest, most efficient, and best quality for each individual prompt. Very excited about all of these things, but still the application layer, I think, is the biggest opportunity right now.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to make sure we can get into discussing how to use multiple models together. And I think that there's this whole kind of concept of a distillation factory and the infrastructure around that you think Microsoft is well positioned to basically provide as there are multiple models. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. But before we do that, Microsoft obviously has been on this interesting journey around open source, right? And this is one of the big things that you did, under your leadership early on, was embracing it. And you had the early partnership with OpenAI, but then also were very clear that in addition to working with closed models, you wanted to make sure that Microsoft served open models well.
Yeah, that is something that I think was the 4D chess move by Satya. He identified very early that OpenAI was an extreme dependency for Microsoft. If they relied on OpenAI for their models and only OpenAI, I think he noticed either with Sam Altman or OpenAI more generally, they had bigger ambitions than just being a model provider, and specifically a model provider to Microsoft. And you could start to see that with the Windsurf acquisition rumors. You can see that with their push to building consumer applications. And so Satya diversified away from that. I've talked a lot about platform risk on this channel. This is exactly that. And I just think his investment into multiple different closed source and open source model providers will be looked upon as one of the greatest strategic corporate moves in history.
And I'm curious how you think about that and how you think that the open source ecosystem is going to evolve and why that's important to your customers and how you think about that with all the infrastructure that you're building.
Yeah, it's interesting you ask that because I grew up, in fact, one of my formative jobs at Microsoft was also making sure that we had interoperability with the various flavors of Unix out there between NT and Unix. And that taught me one thing, which is interoperability is what, first of all, customers demand. And if you do a good job of it, that's good for your business, and obviously you're meeting customers where they are. I'm not dogmatic about closed source or open source. Both of them are needed in the world. And in fact, I think customers will demand them, right? Even if any one of us has dogma, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the world will break that way, which is there will be a need for it. It also fits with what you just talked about, because a lot of my enterprise customers want to be able to distill, in many cases, models that they own. It's their IP. So that in that place where an open weight model has a huge structural advantage.
I'm very surprised to hear that. I've had a lot of conversations with business leaders who are thinking about the ways that their company is going to adopt AI. And it has been very seldom that they are saying, I want to fine tune my own model. I want to distill my own model. And I've said it on this channel before. 9 times out of 10, fine tuning is not necessary for your business. Usually, RAG, retrieval augmented generation, is the answer. Making sure that you're giving the right context to the model at the right time. All right, next, they're going to talk about a topic very near and dear to my heart, agents. So let's watch.
Yeah, so how, you mentioned agents and increasing productivity, and that's obviously a huge theme for the whole ecosystem and community. I'm curious, how are you seeing that play out inside Microsoft? And then also, how are you seeing that, what are some of the most interesting examples that you're seeing with developers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that obviously has been most helpful for us to see is what's happened with software development, right? I mean, there are a couple of things. If you look at even the evolution of GitHub Copilot, you started with code completions. Then you said, let's add chat. So that means you don't need to go to Reddit or Stack Overflow, and you could stay in the flow. So that is good. Then the agentic workflow, so you could just go assign a task. So those three things, if I look at even any one of us using it, you're using all three at all the time, right? So it's not like one substitutes the other. And now you have a proto-SWE agent even. And so you can literally go high-level prompt, or you can just get a PR assigned to a SWE agent. So all four of those and the productivity gains, the biggest lesson learned there, Mark, is you got to integrate all of that with your current repo and your current developer workflow, right? I mean, it's one thing to build a new greenfield app, but none of us get to work on complete greenfield all the time, right? So
obviously, that's a very good point. There's a lot of existing code, a lot of existing processes and teams out there. So we need to build all of this AI infrastructure for coding directly into the processes that people are used to. But personally, I'm more excited about that greenfield. I want to think about, what does the future of coding look like when it is almost entirely, if not entirely, done by agents? What does the IDE look like? What does that orchestration interface look like? It likely doesn't look like VS Code, to be honest. VS Code looks the way it does because we as humans need to be able to read and write code in the easiest, most efficient way possible. But when agents are doing that, maybe the interface can be completely different. What does that interface look like for an orchestrator? And even beyond that, what does code look like when it doesn't necessarily have to be written by or for humans? If agents are writing the code, agents are reading the code, the computer is executing the code, why does it need to look like natural language at all? And it kind of does, even though we have all of this syntax around it. Ultimately, when we look at it, it kind of resembles natural language. Now, it's that way because humans are really bad at writing symbolic code, for example. So I'm really excited to think through what that looks like. Okay, let's keep watching.
There's no need for somebody to prepare anything just because it's all available on tap. So it requires you to change work artifact and workflow, and that's a lot of change. And it happens slowly at first and then all of a sudden.
Here's what Cursor's Aman Sanger had to say recently. Cursor writes almost 1 billion lines of accepted code a day. That is absolutely insane to think about. And that is just Cursor. That's not including Replit, Windsurf, Klein, and the other AI coding tools out there. To put it in perspective, the entire world produces just a few billion lines a day. So Cursor already is a substantial percentage of all of the code written. And this is exactly what I've been talking about for a while. We're going to see this absolute explosion in the amount of code written every single day. And more importantly, we're going to see an explosion in the amount of people who can write code because of things like vibe coding, because of being able to describe what you want to see built from absolutely nothing in natural language to something that actually manifests and you can deploy and other people can use it, you can use it. And that is so exciting to me to go from, I don't know actually how many developers there are in the world, maybe a few million, to literal billions of people who can write anything that they want. All right, so that's all I want to cover for today. There's a little bit towards the end about model distillation and a call to developers to build meaningful, functional tools for the real world. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.